You'll know that we're in the middle of a series which is looking at the 5 aspects of the spiritual life, and it's looking at those by looking at stories that illustrate them. So the 5 aspects of the spiritual life are integration, positive emotion, spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And we've got as far where it's still in integration. And we've been looking at integration, particularly in terms of how we integrate the lower parts of ourselves. You might call them the lower parts. So those are the bits of ourselves that we find a bit yucky and we don't really want to know about. So we've had quite a few talks looking at that. But actually, integration isn't just about getting in touch with our lower side. It's also about getting in touch with the higher potential that we all have. And that's what this talk is about tonight. So I'm going to explore it through 2 stories. One is a Western story and one's a traditional Buddhist story. And so we're talking about the fact that all of us have higher potential and a higher self, you might call it, a higher self that's often hidden to ourselves, actually. It's not part of our everyday experience. And I've kind of invented a distinction between 2 different types of higher self. So one is what you might call a kind of sublime higher self, and the other is a more mundane one. So I'm going to talk about those as well, and then I'm going to, having invented the distinction between the 2, I'm going to say actually maybe there isn't really a distinction between the 2 at all. Okay, so I'm going to start with a story, and this is a story that I remember. I don't remember exactly from my childhood, but I certainly remember the feeling that I had from the story when I was a child. And it's a story from The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. So you might know that from all the kind of like stuff about Toad, kind of going beep beep and all that kind of stuff. This is a very different story, actually. So it's about a couple of animals who are rat and mole. And it's midsummer, a beautiful midsummer's day, been a really, really hot day on the river. But there's a baby otter who's gone missing, and the otter's parents are really, really desperate looking for this baby otter. So what happens is late at night, Rat and Mole decide they're going to row up and down the river looking for the baby otter, seeing if they can find the baby otter and take him home to his parents. So they set off. Rat is rowing. It's a really still night, beautiful night out on the river. The moon is just rising. Very, very kind of atmospheric night. And just before dawn, they row all night. Just before dawn, Rat starts to hear some music. So he hears this music somewhere. It's a music or it's a song, and it causes him to be entranced. They've been chatting, they're really good friends, Rat and Mole. They've been chatting, but he just falls silent. He's entranced, he's spellbound by this music that he can hear. And what he says is, row on, Mole. Row for the music. The music and the call must be for us. So he's saying there's a call. The call must be for us. And as they row, the music becomes clearer to Rat. He starts to hear it a little bit more. But Mole's not hearing it until finally Mole starts to hear it. And what Kenneth Grahame wrote is that Mole was breathless and transfixed. He stopped rowing as the liquid run of that glad piping broke on him like a wave, caught him up and possessed him utterly. So Mole rows on. And what happens as they row on, Kenneth Grahame writes, never had they noticed the roses so vivid, the willow herb so riotous, the meadow sweet so odorous and pervading. Eventually they come to a small island. It's fringed with willow, silver birch, alder. It's a magical time, just before dawn on a summer's day. Rat says, this is the place of my song dream. This is the place that the music played to me. So they get out, they start to walk through the undergrowth on the island. And suddenly Mole feels a great awe come upon him that turns his muscles to water. He bowed his head and rooted his feet to the ground. It was no panic terror. Indeed, he was wonderfully at peace and happy. But it was an awe that smote and held him, and without seeing. He knew it could only mean that some august presence was very, very near. There was utter silence as the light grew and grew. So then Mole looks up and he sees the great god Pan, with the baby otter nestling at his feet. He's huge with horns. He's like, yeah. And so the 2 animals see the great god Pan. who's coming, even though it's certainly not midsummer. So Mole looks up, the two animals see the great god Pan with the baby otter, and what happens is the two animals bow their heads and worship. Sudden and magnificent, the sun's broad golden rim showed itself over the horizon, facing them, dazzling them. When they were able to look once more, the vision had vanished, and the air was full of the carol of birds that hailed the dawn. So they've seen a vision of Pan, and then it's disappeared as the sun has come up. And actually what happens to them is through the magic of Pan, is they lose that memory. So they lose that memory. They don't know what had happened, but they know that something happened. They take the otter back home, the baby otter back home to his parents, but they know that something's happened. And the rat, afterwards, they talk about it with each other, and the rat's going, something happened. There was like a tune. I can hear this tune. It's like a lilting tune that's running on without a stop. It comes into my hearing and it passes out of my hearing. I catch it. There's music and then nothing but the reed's soft, thin whispering. So what's happened to them is they've had this big experience, this awe-inspiring, magical experience, but then they've lost it. They've forgotten it. They know that something happened, but they don't know what it is. So perhaps maybe we have that experience sometimes. We hear the sound of those pipes, that music, we half remember something, but we can't quite remember what it is. It's the call of the higher. It's the calling us to something more than we are now. So that's what we're talking about, that call. So you might remember in the intermediate course, that we looked at the Noble Eightfold Path. And actually what the Noble Eightfold Path is integrating vision, that call of our higher self, into our everyday life, so it becomes our everyday experience. So if you remember, in the intermediate course, we spent a bit of time thinking about our vision. What brought us to want to explore things by coming to the Buddhist Centre or exploring other paths? We talk about our vision, and then we talk about the rest of the stages of the Eightfold Path of being about transformation. And it's great to have vision, but you need to transform it and put it into your everyday life as well. And if you do that, it feeds back into your vision again. So really, what's going on here is an integration of a higher self, a higher call, when we have that experience of some kind of vision. So the psychologist Jung says that not only do we repress those depths that we've talked about in the last few weeks, those depths we don't like, but we also repress the divine. So it's not just the grungy parts of ourselves that we deny, that we keep in the shadows. We also deny our higher selves, our more spiritual selves. And I don't know why that is. I think there's lots of reasons. One is that it's kind of socially unacceptable, actually, amongst some people. So many work situations, if you went into work on Monday and went, wow, I was out in the Peak District and I saw this sunset and it just blew my head off and it was the most amazing thing. I mean, in some work situations, they go great, but in many, you might get some very strange looks. It might be that your family's not into that kind of thing. Some of your friends aren't. It's not a thing that we talk about in our society very much. And I suppose for ourselves, we might not give ourselves the space or opportunity to allow those things, the higher self, to even make itself known to us. So that's why we're saying that an important part of integration is opening up to the higher. And we can see that as either being the higher potential in ourselves. So that story I told you about rat and mole, it could have been, Pan could represent a part of themselves, a kind of divine part of themselves. Or you can see it as something external to ourselves. But wherever it is, because it's beyond our everyday self, our self as it is now, it's likely to be experienced as being external to ourselves. Okay? So because it's different from our everyday experience, when we do get this call, we're very much likely to experience it as if it's coming from outside ourselves. And I think that if we do learn to hear that call and we respond to it, actually our lives become a bit more enjoyable, magical, and a bit more meaningful. So what we can try and do is make it more part of who we are and give it a stronger voice. So if you imagine there's lots of different voices going on in yourself, we talked about that a bit last week actually, lots of different parts, aspects of ourselves. higher part, if we can give it a stronger part in determining how we live, I think our lives are going to be just a lot more enjoyable. So, and that's also, interestingly, integrating the higher into ourselves actually helps us, could even be essential in integrating the lower. So when we're talking about the lower, we're talking about things like the anger, the jealousy, the craving that we kind of try and keep down and pretend we don't have. And actually, how it seems to work is that those lower aspects of ourselves will only bow their knee to something they recognise that's coming from a higher level than themselves. So a bit like the willing subjects of a monarch will bow if they recognise that the monarch is actually higher than they are. It's a bit like our lower energies will bow to a higher goal. They'll actually get involved and be on the side of the higher goal. And serving something higher than ourselves can really help with that as well. So, Buddhist tradition is full of stories where people have accessed a higher wisdom and they've allowed that to transform them and to transform their world. And how it's often told in the stories is that it's as if those people who've had those experiences have visited a different higher plane of being, and they've been taught by a higher being. So an example of that is somebody who's called Asanga. He's an Indian Buddhist teacher, and he lived in about the 3rd century. And he was the founder of a really important school of Buddhist thought, which is called the Yogacara, which I'm not going to even try and explain. But it's really worth reading if you're into that kind of thing. And actually his thoughts, the way that he saw the world did really change Buddhist thought and really influenced many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of people. But the way the story is told is that he was meditating for 12 years in a cave. And after those 12 years, he's actually given the teachings by the future Buddha, who's called Maitreya. So traditionally, the idea is that there are 3 Buddhas of this era. There's the past Buddha, the current Buddha Shakyamuni, who's our Buddha that we've got, and there will be at some point in the future another Buddha called Maitreya. And the story is that this Buddha took Asanga, this Indian teacher, up to the Tushita heaven, as it's called, and he learnt those teachings there, and then he brought them back to India and taught them. And those teachings that he brought back, well, they reinvigorated Buddhism. Buddhism had got a bit kind of dry, a bit kind of intellectual, and it really affected a whole culture. And of course, they made Asanga himself a much stronger, more potent person. So we're going to come back to Asanga later. So in this story, it's as if the teachings don't come from him, but they come from another being, a holy place. And in a way, that's also like what happened for Rat and Mole, I think. It's like they had an experience of something that seemed to be like from another world, a being who's from another world in a very holy place. But as I said when I started the talk, as well as those big visions that we can experience, I think there's also a kind of more mundane, everyday kind of higher self. And actually, mundane is not really the right word, because that makes it sound kind of a bit boring or something, and I think it's not. But I think we have a very everyday kind of higher self that we can ignore, or we can allow ourselves to listen to and be influenced by. And actually, I really want to thank Satyajyoti. We drove in a car for ages with each other, and she was talking about that. I thought that's really true, actually. That it's like there is a higher self that can be, that's kinder, that's generous, that reaches out to somebody else, that in a situation thinks, what can I give here rather than what I can take? So it's ourselves at our best. Yeah, so you'll know those times when, for some reason, you're in a good place and you find yourself able to give a lot more than you ever thought you would. Be a different kind of person. So maybe we're more thoughtful, thinking of others a lot more, we're more playful. We can just bring the best to a situation, think what's really needed here and be able to do it. And I think I was thinking a little bit of kind of perhaps someone like, I don't know, Mark Chipp, who some of you will know, who's a Sangha member, who responded to the crisis with the refugees by actually getting a whole van load of stuff and going to Calais and taking it. And I thought there was something that was his higher self that just actually did something and went and did it. And lots of people do things like that. But there are times when we find ourselves just giving more than we ever thought we could, actually. And I suppose we know that at times it's much easier to be in touch with that mundane self, and at times it's much harder. So what helps us to open up to this higher self, this more playful, more loving self? And also what helps us to open up to these kind of visions of a a more magical world? Well, I think the first thing is that we need to make space to allow the higher to talk to us, because it's really not going to talk to us if we're completely busy all the time. I'm sure you know that experience, that when you're busy in the middle of life, there's just no time for anything else to happen. When you maybe go on retreat, or you go for a walk, or you have a holiday, actually then all sorts of other things can start to arise. We need less input, we need less distraction, and we need a bit of quiet time, a bit of solitude. Like Asanga had actually when he was in that cave meditating for 12 years. That allowed something to appear to him. Yeah, 12 years, just spent 12 years in the cave. And I think also there's something in our approach. So I was reminded of this story, and I was thinking about something I said on Saturday, but there's in the book about meditating by Wildmind, there's a really lovely story, which is how do you approach meditating? So it's particularly how do you approach the metabhavana, or receptivity, if you're trying to be receptive. So if you imagine that you're going into the wood, perhaps the wild wood where rat and mole live, but if you're going into the wood, and you want to see the little animals come out, if you go in there really, really noisy and then sit down and make loads of noise, you're not going to see anything, are you? But if you go in really quietly and then you sit and you wait and you get really, really bored, you have to wait and get really, really bored and think nothing's going to happen, then gradually those little creatures will start to stick their noses out and you'll start to hear some rustles in the undergrowth, and you might even catch sight of a rat or a mole. So I think there's something about that way of approaching our lives where we give space and allow something to come to us that will allow the higher to arise in us. The second thing we can do is when we meditate, well, first of all, meditate is good, but the second thing is to regard any meditation experiences we have as real. Okay, so if something happens in your meditation, it can be a bit of a kind of thing to go, oh God, that was a bit weird, and maybe it was me, just like a fantasy I had, it was a bit strange. But I think if something happens, well, it's real in a way, and the more we regard it as being real, the more helpful it will be to us. And actually, if we approach our meditation like that, we're then more likely to have more experiences like that. You know, that bit of ourselves will open up, relax a bit, and we'll be able to get in touch with more experiences like that. I think linked to that is valuing, nurturing our spiritual imagination. Okay, so that might be imagining the figures, the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas that we talk about. If you've got any connection with those, spending time with those. It might be reading stories, mythical stories, just really developing our spiritual imagination. It's like we all have this wonderful human faculty for imagination that no other creatures have. It's a really amazing thing. If we just use it to imagine everything that could go wrong in our lives, that's such a shame. That tends to be what I do when I'm busy, actually. So it's a bit like we can use that amazing faculty to just imagine a more wonderful world, which is much more mythic, where things are talking to us in a much more mythic way. A way to encourage that to happen is to expose ourselves to the arts. So to watch plays, films, read books, listen to music. At the moment I'm watching War and Peace, actually, and there's some lovely bits in it, actually, which are kind of like magical moments. Like if anyone else has watched it, there was a bit where a young woman saw a wolf. They were on a wolf hunt, and she saw the wolf. And then there was another bit where one of the characters saw two girls playing in an orchard. And the way it's filmed is you really get a sense that these are really like magical moments. These are something almost higher, different, that's calling to them. So I think there's something about, if we connect with the arts, we can learn to access that side of ourselves more. Taking time to appreciate beauty, so getting out into nature, and particularly getting out to nature on our own when we've got time to really enjoy it, actually. And paying attention to our Shraddha. So Shraddha is an interesting word. It's kind of conventionally translated as meaning faith, or traditionally sometimes translated as meaning faith. But actually, what it really gets at, Sangharakshita has called the response of what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. So the response of what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. So Shraddha is a kind of yearning, I think, something more, something better, that things could be different. And I think when we have that feeling, I think it's really important if we want to grow spiritually, that we trust it, that we listen to it, and that we go with it. So valuing the intuition that tells us that perhaps we do want to do things, go on retreats, develop our spiritual life. Taking part in puja, of course, and other devotional practices. And when we do them, trying our best not to censor any feelings we might get of devotion or reverence. Because it's kind of in our society, it can be quite cynical, can't it? It can be like we're not really encouraged to feel devotion or reverence for something higher. And in puja, we can do that. And sometimes, especially at first, it can be really easy to cut off from that. I'm just going to have a drink of water. And actually, just generally cultivating other positive emotions can lead us to be more in touch with our higher selves. So we're going to be talking about that in the next few talks. So people who came on the retreat will remember we did a lot about gratitude, how getting in touch with gratitude can actually get yourself in touch with a better, higher version of yourself. And joy, metta, those other positive emotions. And there's a particular emotion that I think is really, really helpful in terms of getting in touch with my better self, which is called mudita. And mudita means sympathetic joy. So when a friend has some good news, well, it's really hard sometimes just not to feel maybe a bit envious or a bit resentful or a bit like, why can't I have the holiday in Sri Lanka? Why can't I have whatever it is? And like a bit kind of, and if mudita is about when you meet someone having a really good time or having something you want, you enjoy it too. You develop the sense in which it's great that they're enjoying it, and then because I'm thinking it's great that they're having that great time, I start to feel really good as well. So it's a wonderful way to have just immense happiness. I wish I remembered it more often, actually, because if you think that just every time that something good happened to someone that you heard about, you were able to meet that with a sense of joy, of sympathetic joy, your life would be full of joy, because good things are happening to people all the time. So I do think mudita is a way of getting in touch, well, allowing that strand of me that does feel positive about other people to grow and to develop. And then just two last things, I think, which is choosing your friends wisely. Because if you choose your friends to be people who also want to be in touch with something higher, something more mythic, something more magical, you're going to get a lot more support in that. And the last one is paying attention to your dreams, the dreams you have at night. Because I think sometimes dreams can give us really strong messages, actually, from our different self, different parts of ourselves. Okay, so I'm just now going to tell the rest of the story about Asanga. So do you remember we met him? He's the one who spent 12 years in a cave. And so Asanga, he was thought to have lived here in the 3rd century. And he was thought to have lived in the area now called Peshawar. And I like that because my grandparents lived in Peshawar, actually. So it's kind of like, somehow it feels like it links me to Asanga in some kind of weird way. Anyway. He was a Buddhist, his mother was a Buddhist, and actually his brother was a very famous teacher as well. So he grew up in a kind of Buddhist family. And he became a monk. He was very, very committed. And he came across some texts, some very old texts called the Paramita texts, which are really kind of very, they're designed to kind of blow your conceptual brain apart. They're very difficult to understand. He couldn't understand them. And he had no help from his teachers. His teachers had got quite dry and into a kind of very intellectual way of approaching the Dharma. And he found that very frustrating. And he was starting to get this real sense, actually, that as well as this kind of intellectual approach to Buddhism, he really wanted to live a life that was dedicated to an active compassion. So he decided what he was going to do is go away and meditate. And he hoped that if he went away to meditate, he'd actually come face to face with this Buddha, Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. Maitreya is particularly associated with compassion. So he hoped that he said that I'm going to go and meditate, and I'm not going to give up until the Buddha Maitreya is manifested before me. However, he meditated day after day after day. 3 years went by, and Maitreya still just hadn't turned up. So he felt really discouraged. So he thought, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go back to my monastery. So he set off, and down near his cave, he came across a little hut. And in the hut, there was a man whose job it was to make needles from iron spikes, big iron spikes. And the way the man did this was he just rubbed it with a piece of cotton. And I don't know how many years it took him to do it, but that's what he did. Maitreya saw this man doing this and he thought, well, if he can be that patient and have that kind of, vision of waiting a long time, I can do it too. So his resolution returned and he went back up to the cave. And this time he meditated for 6 years without stopping. And still no Maitreya. So this really disheartened, Asanga left the cave. And this time he saw there was a rock. And this rock had been completely worn down, partly by single drops of water, but also by the beating wings of passing birds. So this rock said, the little bit of kind of erosion that happens from that had worn this rock right down. So he thought, okay, back to the cave, I can do it. So he was there for 12 years, and still no Maitreya had not turned up at all. So this time he'd really despaired completely. And he set out to return to his monastery. I can imagine he just really dragging himself along the streets. So he came to a town, and on the outskirts of town he saw this old dog who was lying in a ditch. And she was in a really bad way. She had lots of wounds in her hindquarters, really bad. So bad that they were crawling with maggots. And he felt a great pity for the dog, a great pity for her. And he really wanted to relieve the suffering. So he thought, what I'll do is I'll move the maggots out. But then he also felt compassion for the maggots. He thought these maggots will suffer if I move them. So he cut a little bit of flesh from his own thigh and he put it on the ground by the dog and set about transferring the maggots. And so as not to harm the maggots, the way that he did that was with his tongue. So he used his tongue to move maggot by maggot onto that little bit of his thigh. And it was quite gruesome, actually, and he found it quite hard. So he shut his eyes. And when he shut his eyes, he heard this great ringing noise, this great ringing of bells. And he opened his eyes, and there was Maitreya in all his glory. Maitreya had appeared at last to him. So he was really obviously full of joy, because he just met Maitreya. But without thinking, Asanga said, so why didn't you ever come and see me in those 12 years that I was meditating up in that cave? And Maitreya said, well, actually, I was with you all the time, but you couldn't see me because you didn't have great compassion. Okay? Until you had that compassion that you just showed to the dog and the maggots, you actually couldn't see me. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to carry me on your shoulders and show me to the people of this town. So Asanga lifted Maitreya, the Buddha of the future times, onto his shoulders, and he carried him through the town, hoping to let everyone see the Buddha. You can imagine him kind of going, look, folks, look, there's the Buddha, Maitreya. But actually what happened is no one in the town saw anything. They didn't see Maitreya carrying anything. Only one old woman saw the dog. Everybody else didn't see anything. She saw that Asanga was carrying a dog. So what Maitreya said from that is people just don't have the compassion to see me until you develop it in the way that you have. So actually Asanga's 12 years of meditating were not a waste. Even though he wasn't aware of it, he'd actually developed a great deal of compassion by doing his meditation. So what happened then was that Maitreya transported Asanga to the heaven, and that's where he studied the Dharma for 50 years. And that's where he had these visions or this understanding of the Yogacara, and he brought those texts back to India. And the story goes that he lived to the age of 120, teaching the knowledge of enlightenment to people. So, So there's lots in that story, I think. But I think actually in a way it brings together, I suppose, what I'm calling those mundane acts of compassion with what you might call the sublime, because it was through a real life act of compassion to the dog and the maggots that Asanga actually saw Maitreya, that he actually had that vision, that kind of higher vision of something sublime. So I think what that says to me that actually, if we are a truly integrated self, we will be in touch with something higher. But it's no good just having these big experiences and then not bringing them back into your life at all. Because lots of people have that. People have all sorts of things, maybe when they're travelling, or if they find themselves in a dangerous situation, maybe like have a near-death experience or something like that. It's quite common for people to have quite big experiences, but then they somehow never manage to change their lives. They just carry on as before. So I think our work is really to develop an integrated self that will express be in touch with a higher self, but we'll be expressing it in our everyday life, that we'll be kinder, we'll be more friendly, we'll be more giving. And I suppose that's where the Noble Eightfold Path comes in, because that is a path that we can follow that covers all aspects of our life and will lead us to an integrated self, integrating the higher into ourselves.